The grass in Jim Holloway's front yard had grown taller than the neighborhood liked to see. Not by much, just enough to ripple in the breeze and brush against a man's shin as he walked by. But in Meadow Ridge Estates, appearances weren't suggestions. They were laws written into binders stacked high on the HOA president's desk. Jim knew the rules. He'd lived under them for nearly a decade, but he was a veteran, retired from 2 tours overseas, and his health had started to falter. Mowing the lawn wasn't something he could always do on schedule. Some days his knees simply wouldn't cooperate, and though neighbors had offered to help, Jim wasn't the kind of man who asked twice. On a hot July morning, he shuffled outside with his cane, squinting at the stretch of grass that had crept up over the last few weeks. Sweat gathered quickly on his forehead. He had every intention of trimming it down, but the mower sat silent in the garage, a heavy beast he wasn't sure he could wrangle anymore. That was when the letter appeared. A bright white envelope with bold red lettering, notice of violation. The HOA seal sat at the top, formal and unyielding. The words inside were sharper than any blade Jim owned. Your lawn is in violation of HOA standards. Failure to correct this issue within 7 days will result in fines and further enforcement action. He folded the letter slowly, his hands trembling more from anger than weakness. He'd faced combat zones and foreign battlefields. Now his biggest fight was with the neighborhood association that claimed to represent him. Neighbors noticed too. Some whispered sympathy when they passed. Others crossed the street, careful not to be seen offering kindness in case the HOA president was watching. And she was always watching. Karen Mitchell, the woman who ran Meadow Ridge's board like her personal kingdom, believed neat lawns were more than aesthetics. They were obedience. When she drove her silver SUV past Jim's house, she saw more than grass. She saw defiance. The second letter came 3 days later. The fine was listed in bold, a number too high for a man living on a fixed pension. Jim crumpled it in his fist and tossed it aside, the sound of paper tearing breaking the silence of his empty kitchen. But the letters didn't stop. They multiplied, stacked, and grew heavier with each delivery. What began as a simple warning became a storm of threats. Increased fines, legal action, and words that made Jim's chest tighten, lean against property. He sat at his kitchen table late into the night, the glow of a single lamp reflecting off framed photographs of him in uniform. Years of service, discipline, and sacrifice stared back at him from the walls. Now, those same walls threatened to be taken away over grass he no longer had the strength to cut. When the knock came on his door, Jim thought it was another neighbor offering quiet support. Instead, it was 2 men in uniform, not military this time, but local law enforcement. Their voices were polite but firm. "Mr. Holloway," one said, "there's been a court order issued over your repeated violations." Jim stared, uncomprehending. "A court order? For my lawn?" The officer nodded, discomfort flickering across his face. "We're here to escort you to county holding until this matter is resolved." The old veteran's knees gave out, not from pain this time, but from the weight of disbelief. The world blurred as he felt hands on his shoulders guiding him out into the humid evening. Neighbors gathered silently, eyes wide, some filming with their phones, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Karen's SUV idled at the corner. She didn't get out. She didn't have to. She watched from behind tinted glass as Jim Holloway, a man who had once saluted his country's flag, was led away in handcuffs because the grass on his lawn had grown too tall, and in that moment, something shifted. Not just for Jim, but for the entire neighborhood, because this was no longer about rules. This was about power, and the whole world was about to hear it. The county jail was colder than Jim expected. Concrete walls, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and a narrow cot that felt more like punishment than rest. He sat quietly, his cane taken from him at intake, his dignity stripped away with it. For a man who once carried rifles across desert terrain, it wasn't the confinement that cut deepest. It was the reason, tall grass, something so trivial it bordered on comedy, if not for the metal bars standing between him and the life he had built. Back in Meadow Ridge Estates, the news spread faster than wildfire. At first, whispers moved from porch to porch, carried in hushed tones. By sunset, the whispers grew into outrage. "Did you hear? They arrested Jim Holloway. For grass. You've got to be kidding. My son mowed for him last summer. He's not lazy, he's just hurting." Phones lit up. Social media groups exploded. What had started as a neighborhood scuffle became a headline waiting to be written. Karen Mitchell, however, doubled down. She marched into the emergency HOA meeting that evening with her clipboard clutched like a gavel. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the room of uneasy board members. "Standards must be upheld," she declared. "If one man lets his yard slide, soon the entire community will follow. Property values will plummet. Discipline must be enforced." Her words echoed against the clubhouse walls, but the faces staring back at her weren't convinced. Even her loyal allies shifted uncomfortably in their folding chairs. No one dared speak against her, not yet. Meanwhile, Jim sat alone in the cell. The metallic clang of a closing door down the hall made him flinch. He closed his eyes, breathing slow and steady, the way he used to calm himself in firefights. But this wasn't war. This wasn't combat. This was humiliation. Hours dragged on. Then, without warning, a guard approached. "Mr. Holloway, you've got visitors." The glass partition separated Jim from the outside world, but when he lifted his eyes, he didn't see neighbors. He saw reporters, cameras, microphones pressed against the slot in the wall, voices firing questions faster than bullets. "Mr. Holloway, how does it feel to be jailed over grass? Do you think the HOA targeted you unfairly? Do you regret not mowing sooner?" Jim shook his head, exhausted. He wasn't looking for fame. He wasn't looking for pity. All he wanted was his freedom back and his dignity. But the moment had already escaped him. His story wasn't his anymore. It belonged to the public. By the next morning, local news stations ran the footage. "Veteran jailed over tall grass." Headlines scrolled across TV screens. Talk radio picked it up. By evening, it reached national outlets. Commentators debated. Some mocked the absurdity. Others raged at the injustice. Veterans groups rallied online, their posts sharp and unforgiving. "A man who fought for our freedom is behind bars for his lawn." Karen saw it too. Her SUV sat parked outside the clubhouse as she scrolled through her phone, watching the storm she never expected gather strength. She told herself it didn't matter. Rules were rules, but the knot in her stomach betrayed her. The HOA had enforced discipline before. They'd fined neighbors for mailboxes an inch too tall, for fences painted the wrong shade of beige. But no one had ever been dragged to jail. Not like this. The neighborhood was split. Some feared Karen's wrath too much to speak out. Others whispered openly now, voices sharpened by anger. He wore a uniform for 20 years. And they lock him up over grass? Karen's gone too far this time. And as outrage turned to organization, something unexpected happened. Jim Holloway's fight became everyone's fight. The HOA had wanted silence. Instead, they had sparked a movement, and it was only just beginning. By the third day, Meadow Ridge Estates no longer felt like a neighborhood. It felt like a battlefield. Reporters in vans lined the streets, their satellite dishes pointing skyward. Neighbors peeked through blinds at the chaos outside, some slipping out to give interviews, others avoiding eye contact altogether. The HOA clubhouse, usually a quiet space for budget meetings and pool reservations, became command central for Karen Mitchell. She arrived early, clipboard under her arm, flanked by 2 board members who looked more nervous than loyal. The blinds stayed shut as the meeting stretched for hours. Outside, angry residents gathered in clusters, holding signs scrawled with permanent markers. "Free Jim. Veterans deserve better." Our HOA is a prison. A single drone hovered above, its buzzing sound reminding everyone that the world was watching. Inside the clubhouse, Karen's tone was ice. "We can't let the media dictate how we enforce our bylaws. If we cave now, the entire structure of Meadow Ridge will collapse." One board member cleared his throat, hesitating. "Karen, people are furious. They're talking recall votes. Karen slammed her pen onto the table, cutting him off. "They'll calm down. They always do. Order must be maintained." But even she could feel it slipping. Meanwhile, Jim Holloway sat in the visitors' room of the county jail, this time across from a lawyer assigned by a veterans' rights group. A younger man, sharply dressed, eyes blazing with indignation. "Mr. Holloway," he said firmly, "you shouldn't even be here. The fines? The lien threats? They're a civil matter, not criminal. This," he tapped the stack of papers, "is an abuse of process. And we're going to fight it." Jim leaned back, weary but grateful. He wasn't used to anyone fighting for him anymore. For years his battles had been his alone, but now he could feel momentum building. Outside the jail, a crowd gathered with American flags waving in the summer heat. Local veterans stood shoulder to shoulder, saluting as TV cameras rolled. Strangers he'd never met chanted his name. Back in the neighborhood, Karen's carefully crafted order unraveled further. Parents whispered at the bus stop. Kids carried stories home. Teenagers live-streamed the growing protests outside the HOA clubhouse. Even her closest allies avoided her calls. On the fourth night, an emergency town hall was called. The community center overflowed, standing room only. Residents packed shoulder to shoulder, some holding signs, others holding copies of their own HOA violation letters. Karen stood at the front, clipboard clutched tightly, her smile forced. "This has gone too far. We are a community of rules. Without them, we have chaos." The room erupted. Voices shouted back, "Rules don't put a veteran in jail." "You've turned this place into a dictatorship." "Enough is enough." Karen's smile faltered. Her eyes darted across the crowd, searching for control she no longer had. And then, in the back of the room, someone raised a phone. On the screen was breaking news. Senator calls for investigation into veteran jailed by HOA. Gasps spread like wildfire. Karen froze, the words echoing louder than any chant. This wasn't just Meadow Ridge anymore. This was national. The HOA had flexed its power. But in doing so, they had unleashed something much larger than themselves. And for the first time, Karen realized she wasn't the one in control anymore. By the time dawn broke the next morning, Meadow Ridge Estates no longer belonged to Karen Mitchell or her board. It belonged to the cameras, the headlines, and the tide of public outrage that refused to slow down. Satellite trucks camped out on corners. Local police rerouted traffic as protesters swelled beyond the gates, waving flags, holding banners, and chanting Jim Holloway's name. What began as a neighborhood squabble over tall grass had now become a national symbol of everything wrong with unchecked HOA power. Inside the Holloway home, Jim's daughter, Emily, scrolled through her phone in disbelief. Her father's face appeared everywhere, on morning talk shows, in newspaper headlines, in endless social media posts. The captions told the story in bold, simple terms. "Veteran jailed over grass." She sat at the kitchen table with a friend who whispered, "They turned your dad into a villain." "Now the whole country sees him as a hero." Emily nodded, but her eyes filled with tears. He never wanted any of this. He just wanted to be left alone. Back at the courthouse, Jim shuffled into the hearing room in his orange jumpsuit, shackles clinking softly against the tile floor. But today was different. Today the gallery was packed with supporters, neighbors, veterans, strangers from other towns, who all stood when he entered. Some saluted. Others clapped. Karen Mitchell was there too, seated stiffly with her lawyer. She wore her usual blazer, her expression carefully rehearsed, but the flush on her cheeks betrayed her. This was not the quiet, controlled courtroom she expected. This was theater, and she was cast as the villain. The judge, weary of the circus that the case had become, looked over the filings. His voice cut through the noise. "It appears Mr. Holloway's imprisonment was not a matter of criminal conduct, but a civil enforcement gone too far. This court finds the detention inappropriate." The room erupted, gasps, applause, shouts of "Justice!" echoing off the walls. Karen's jaw clenched, but her lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently. Even he could see the tide turning. The HOA had no ground to stand on anymore. Jim, his eyes misting, turned slightly to see his daughter in the crowd. She mouthed two words he hadn't heard in a long time. "You're free." That evening, Jim walked out of the county jail into the arms of cheering supporters. Cameras flashed, microphones shoved toward his face. He raised a hand, humble, not wanting to grandstand, but the symbolism of that moment could not be denied. Meanwhile, back in Meadow Ridge, Karen's pristine world crumbled. Neighbors she had once ordered around now crossed the street to avoid her. Anonymous letters flooded her mailbox, not with support, but with demands. Resign. We're done. Justice for Jim. The HOA's iron grip, once unchallenged, now looked brittle. Every violation letter, every fine, every threat of a lien was suddenly under scrutiny. The residents, once quiet and compliant, had found their voice, and they weren't afraid anymore. The question now wasn't whether Jim Holloway would be free. It was whether Meadow Ridge itself would ever recover from what the HOA had done. Because once the world shines a spotlight on a small neighborhood's darkest corners, the shadows never look the same again. The days that followed felt like a storm breaking. The air in Meadow Ridge Estates, once tight with fear and whispered complaints, now buzzed with a new energy, anger, determination, and a hunger for change. Neighbors who had stayed silent for years now gathered in living rooms, planning petitions and recall votes. Long-forgotten stories of fines and threats resurfaced. One woman fined for a child's bike left outside, another for planting the wrong flowers. Each story added fuel to the fire. The HOA board, once untouchable, now faced a community united against them. Resignation letters trickled in from members unwilling to stand in the blast radius of Karen Mitchell's decisions. But Karen herself? She refused to step down. On the evening news, her voice trembled as she defended her actions. Rules are rules. Without them, a community falls into chaos. But those words no longer carried weight. Clips of veterans saluting Jim Holloway played side by side with Karen's soundbite. The contrast was devastating. Jim, meanwhile, returned home to find his lawn overgrown, his house worn down by months of neglect. But this time he wasn't alone. Dozens of neighbors showed up with mowers, clippers, paint, and tools. Together they restored the house in a single day. Strangers brought food, kids carried supplies. Veterans shook his hand with pride. Emily stood at the porch, tears in her eyes as she watched her father finally smile. An unguarded, genuine smile that had been missing for years. The media soon moved on, as it always does. But Meadow Ridge was never the same. Within weeks, Karen faced a recall election she couldn't escape. Under pressure, she resigned, her once commanding presence reduced to silence. The neighborhood held its first free vote in years. New leaders were chosen, people who promised transparency, fairness, and most importantly, humanity. And Jim? He never sought revenge. When asked by a reporter what he wanted most, he simply said, "I want peace. For me, for my daughter, and for everyone here." The story of the veteran jailed for tall grass became a cautionary tale told far beyond Meadow Ridge. For some, it was about HOA abuse. For others, about the strength of a community finding its voice. But for Jim Holloway, it was something simpler. It was about dignity, the kind no board, no bylaw, and no fence line could ever take away. And in the quiet of a freshly trimmed lawn, under a setting sun, he finally had it back.